As we continue our series in the book of 1 Peter, we come to a really difficult subject, suffering. Peter's going to talk about suffering in the passage we're going to look at this morning. And all of us hate suffering. In fact, we do everything possible to avoid suffering. There are whole industries out there meant to help you avoid suffering. And the real question before us is, how do we handle it? We are all going to face suffering. In fact, if I went around to every one of you, sat down with every single one of you, and had a conversation, you'd have an opportunity to tell me how you are suffering. And every one of you is probably suffering in some way. So it's really important that we understand, how do we handle suffering? So that brings me to our passage in 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 12. Let me read what Peter says to an audience who is indeed suffering. He's writing to these Jewish Christians living in the Roman Empire, scattered all over the Roman Empire. And as I've said before, they're outsiders. They are kind of separated from the culture. They are separated from other people, and they are suffering. So he talks about how do they handle it. Verse 12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. As we think about the subject of suffering, there's a number of things that come up that we need to unpack in this passage. First of all, what is the nature of suffering itself? Because suffering doesn't always come from the same sources. There are different causes to the suffering that all of us deal with. So what are some of those causes? Second, how do we respond to suffering? Because we can respond really in either a way that's kind of according to what God would desire for us, that brings glory to God, or we can respond in a way that's contrary to God's desires and actually just leaves us broken and empty. And then the third major thing is, where is God in the middle of our suffering? Because when we're suffering, we want nothing more than God to take it away. And so when he doesn't do that, we ask the question, where is he? Where is God in the middle of our suffering? As we sat down to talk about this passage this past week as pastors, because every week we sit down, we talk about the passage that we're going to be bringing to you. We really wrestled over this passage because it's very difficult, because we know some of the situations that you are in. We know how you are suffering. And so we really wrestled with this passage. And so we decided to do something a little different today, because I didn't want to just stand up here as some foremost expert in suffering, because I'm not. In fact, many of you know way more about suffering than I do, because you're experiencing it, you're living it right now. But this is the kind of subject that's actually worth having a conversation over. So we're going to have a conversation today, because I can't sit down with every one of you and have a conversation, but you can listen in on a conversation. So I'm going to invite up Josh Whitelock to come up and join me. Josh and I are going to have a conversation together. Now, Josh is our production lead. That means he handles all of the lights, all the audio-visual things in this room. He handles everything that's happening online for our ministry, so our online service. Those of you who are joining with us, thank you.
Of course.
But Josh is more than just our production guy. Well, for one thing, he's my friend.
Absolutely.
Josh also has a great understanding of the Word of God. He's been in ministry for a number of years. Mm-hmm. He also understands our culture. And so I thought it might be really kind of fun.
Yeah, I think it'll be good.
Suffering's not fun, but you and I talking about suffering might be a little fun.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about some of the stuff that comes out in this passage.
Absolutely. There's so much in here, and it's so rich. And the fun part of this conversation, I love podcasts. So I love being able to sit and be the guy who,
like a podcast.
Right, like the Joe Rogan of the conversation, who's just like, yeah, but what about this? And what about that?
Okay, so, we're not going 3 hours. Though.
No, we're not
doing that.
We'll be good.
Joe Rogan style.
But I hope I can do a good job representing the questions that maybe our people have that whether it's with their friends outside the church or something that they're saying, I have these questions, I don't know how to navigate this stuff. Yeah. Nate, you have so much info to bring on this. Like when I picked your brain this week a little bit, I was just amazed by like your study of the passage and like the time that you spent in it. And really though, I guess to kind of start the question, because we really do need to start off here, we talk about suffering, but like, what does that actually look like, right? We can think of Job as a good example, like financial suffering, relational suffering, physical suffering, status suffering. But in this passage, when he talks about suffering, what is going on?
I think it's helpful just think about suffering in general for the first, and think about where suffering comes from. So in some cases, you might be suffering because of something that you have done to yourself. Mm-hmm. You're suffering the consequences of your own actions, okay? And that's hard.
Yeah, I've done that.
And it doesn't take anything away from the fact that it's really difficult to deal with it, even though you know that it kind of results from what you've done. But there's other cases, and so many of you are suffering not because of something you've done, but because you live in a broken world. Okay, so you think about disease, cancer, disability, like all of those things. They don't result from something you've done. Yeah. They aren't your fault. But it is suffering, and it's probably the most pervasive suffering that's probably being experienced by people in this room right now. There's a third thing, though, that's different, and that's suffering for Jesus. That's really what Peter is focusing on here. I'm sure that the people he's writing to are suffering in any number of ways. Yeah. Okay, I'm sure they're suffering as a result of their own actions. I'm sure they're suffering because of disease and disability. Absolutely. Okay, they didn't even have the health care that we have. I'm sure they're suffering. But he's even more concerned about that third one, suffering because of Jesus. And that's really what he wants to focus on here in this passage.
Yeah, kind of reminds me earlier in like church history, right? There was a period of time where there was a group of believers who would inflict more physical suffering on themselves to try and replicate Jesus, taking the cross up and the pain that he went through.
Peter's saying it's not necessary.
That's not what's going on here, right?
Yeah,
right. And there's something more meaningful, more impactful than self-harm that's going on, that's actually happening that we're talking about in the suffering here. But what I do find interesting, though, as we talk about this, because suffering is such a wide topic, but he says that we'll be surprised by like a strange suffering, right?
Yeah, like a funny word.
Don't be surprised. Yeah, don't be surprised when something strange were happening to you. So what is going on with Peter's audience? What is he writing about? What is this strange suffering?
Well, I think it's interesting. He starts with that little comment there. Don't be surprised.
Yeah.
Because I think we are surprised by suffering. Okay, we do think suffering is strange.
Yeah.
Because we're not made for suffering. Okay, we were made to be with God in his presence, enjoying his presence forever. Mm-hmm. Okay, think back to the garden. Think back to the Garden of Eden. That's what we were created for. And so when we experience suffering in all of the types of suffering that you can think of, there is a sense that this isn't right. Like it's not supposed to be this way.
It's not home, right? Like
this
isn't
it's not
what
home.
We're supposed to experience.
And so I think that's why it can feel strange.
Yeah.
But Peter's like, no, it's not strange, and you shouldn't be surprised by it. Because honestly, we don't handle surprise very well. Do you handle surprise very well?
It depends. It depends.
What kind of surprise do you handle well?
Like if it's my birthday, right, and like somebody hands me a gift.
Is your birthday today?
No, well, I mean, look, if you want to give me gifts, you still can. But if it's my birthday and you surprise me with a gift, I'm like, whoa, this is awesome.
You'd be okay with
this
that
is amazing.
Surprise.
Absolutely okay. But if like my doctor calls me up, it's like, hey, surprise. Got bad news for you, right? Like maybe not the surprise that I want to hear, but that sounds more like the surprise that we actually face.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we don't know what's going to come.
Okay.
And so Peter's like, you just need to be prepared.
Yeah.
You need to be prepared for what's coming. And as Peter writes this, like, what are they experiencing? Well, certainly they're Jews and Christians, both at the same time living within this Roman culture.
Yeah.
So they're different from the people around them. They live differently. And there's probably a sense of like oppression, like maybe people exclude them for certain parts of the culture, things like that. But as Peter writes this, Nero is the emperor. Okay, so Nero, if you know anything about Nero, he's a bad man, okay? This is just the very beginning of his rule. And Nero actually begins a 200-year stretch where believers go from just being kind of outsiders in the culture to being physically oppressed and abused by the Roman Empire. Nero himself, like, in fact, it's interesting because Peter says, he calls it the fiery trials here, which is an interesting little phrase. I think it's a metaphor, like fire is painful and suffering can be painful. So I think there's this sense of like, you need to be ready for painful suffering. But I think there's also a sense that Peter maybe is a little prophetic here, because Nero actually burns down part of the city of Rome. He actually wants to renovate part of the city. He's like, the easiest way to do that is just burn it down.
That makes sense. I mean, that's logical.
But then he can't say to people, I burned it down. So he blames the Christians. Okay, this little tiny group of believers there in Rome, he blames them. And so that begins this persecution, this intense persecution, where believers are even taken. He actually sets them on fire and uses Christians to light his courtyards.
So, like, next time I say I'm on fire for Jesus, I should be a little bit more cautious. Is
Yes,
that okay?
that's exactly right.
Make sure. Make sure. But that kind of brings now back to today, because I think sometimes it kind of feels conspiracy theory-ish as believers when we're like, well, you never know, tomorrow the government might start imprisoning Christians. But that was exactly what's going on here, right? Like, it reminds me of Paul, right? Paul would often go into a city and start to evangelize, and as he's doing so, the guards would come, the police would come for him, and he'd be like, hold up, I'm a Roman citizen. There are procedures you have to follow here, right? And we love our rights. We love our Constitution and the rights that it grants us. But what happens when all of a sudden that fiery moment occurs, right? Because the people Peter's writing to, they're not expecting that. They're not expecting that all of a sudden their emperor's going to burn down a part of the city and then blame it on them. That's wild. That's insane.
Yeah,
I mean, literally,
insane.
the action of it
It
was
really
insane,
is insane.
right? And so, what is that thing? Like, what as believers, we have to be ready for what's around the corner. But what's going on right now? What's going on today that we should be careful
the reality is we're not experiencing anything like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going to happen to Christians in that culture? The kind of physical abuse that they're going to undergo.
Yeah.
That's nothing, we don't experience anything like that. And so the question is, how are we ready for that?
Yeah.
Because we don't know what's around the corner. And honestly, if we can't handle even some of the small ways, the small suffering that we might experience, we can't handle the larger things when they come. And that's part of what I see here for myself is like, okay, I'm not currently experiencing significant suffering in my life. I'm really grateful for that, okay? We shouldn't actually ask for and desire suffering.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not something like, please give me more suffering. No, we're not meant for that. But the question is, when we experience it, am I ready for it? Yeah. And Peter's like, you need to be ready for it. And so it's like for us, like in this culture, what kind of things do we experience? Okay, we already talked about some of the things that we can't control. Yeah. But what about suffering for Jesus? Like, what does that look like in our culture? Yeah. I think part of it is, I was talking to one of our staff members this past week, who actually, he works part-time here and part-time in a different job. At his other job, people know that he's a believer, and they will treat him differently because of this. So for instance, he was with one of his coworkers, and his coworkers let out a curse word, okay? Not unusual at all. Yeah. And he turned to this guy, the guy on our staff, and he kind of like, oh, I'm so sorry that I cursed in front of you. And you've probably all experienced little things like this, not a big deal. But the whole point of what his coworker is trying to do is draw a distinction between the two of them. Yeah. And to kind of say, oh, you're the different one. You're different. I'm like everybody else, but you're different. And I'm going to point it out because I want you to kind of feel bad about being different. And I think that's what happens to a lot of us, is that we're made to feel bad, maybe by a coworker, maybe by a family member, but certainly in the culture as a whole. Like, anytime you see something on television, movies, anywhere in our culture, where Christians are mischaracterized, It's meant to draw a distinction between us and everybody else in the world, to cause us to back down. In fact, Peter says in verse 16, he says, one of the things this could cause you is to be ashamed, to feel ashamed. And we can feel a sense of shame, and that's purposeful by people in our culture, to shame us, to cause us to step back and to not follow Jesus, not live our lives the way that he wants us to live them.
Kind of going back to that story, that example you tell, I do find though that sometimes it's not always also to make the distinction between us and them, but I do find that people will often look at Christians as kind of like a morality police at times, right? Like they'll look to us as a moral standing, but what gets very fascinating with it is that they'll ask us these questions. Cursing is such an easy one to use because it feels like a soft one, right? Like we don't have to hit a hard topic with that one, right? So they'll say a word and then they'll look at you and they'll be like, hey, is that okay? Like, I didn't upset you, right? Like, you're cool with that? And then you usually go, yeah, it's fine, whatever, like, doesn't bother me. And that kind of validates for a second for them of like, okay, I'm not actually doing anything wrong. The Christian says I'm good. So I'm morally pretty good. The harm then comes when it's like
it's worse as a
that
pastor,
harder.
by the way.
Yeah,
when people know you're a pastor.
I kind of actively avoid telling people I work at a church because it changes. It changes people around you. But what then becomes crazy though is when it becomes like the bigger issues, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm cheating on my spouse. Hey, like I believe in this, or I really want to do this. I want justification, and they're seeking a justification from you. And all of a sudden, when you go, oh, no, I don't think that's good, or oh, I disagree with that, or biblically.
That's where the rub comes.
The rub comes in because all of a sudden, they're trusting you to be their moral kind of pillar, but at the same time, they want you to be a moral pillar that supports what they want to do. Because I truly believe that our souls were designed, as designed by God, our souls recognize sin, and our souls hate sin, right? Deeply hate it. And so they scream out when our flesh leads us into sin. And so we try to find voices in our life, people in our life that maybe can speak a little bit louder than our soul's speaking to us, to be like, no, that's okay, it's good, like, that's all right. If you're not happy with your marriage, that's fine. And you know where it gets really tough, I find? I worked in youth ministry for years. Actually, I got to see all four of your children go through youth ministry, which was amazing. Caleb's graduating, we just graduated, so he's heading off to college this year, which is exciting. But parents, it is hard. Like, it is hard for parents when they have to start telling their kids no about stuff. But all their friends at school are telling them yes about that thing. Like, that's a tough one to navigate.
I think that's partly where we might see real persecution for our faith that we don't even realize it. Yeah. Okay, it's one thing if it's like a coworker saying something, or a neighbor or somebody like that. Like, you can just shrug that off in some respect, okay, unless you're really close to them. But what if your child, and I know that this is the case for many of you in this room, what if your child, your grown child, your late teens, adult child, is walking away from the faith? Is rejecting everything that you stand for, everything that you believe, everything that you have taught them? Well, there's some real persecution there. There's a real sense of like, oh, this really hurts. Like, to be separated from this loved one of mine, to be different from them, I think that hurts more than just about anything else. And I think it is an aspect of persecution. I think it is an aspect of standing for Jesus, even when it means that you potentially are separated from somebody that you love deeply.
I had a front row seat to watching in my family. My parents have two of their children basically step away from a relationship with them entirely for a season because they were desiring to hold their kids to something that was healthy and good for them and create healthy balances, biblical balances in their life. And then to watch their children walk away, run away from home, go wherever. And luckily those relationships are reconciled now, and it's beautiful now, it's amazing now, but the amount of hurt and pain that comes when you have to look at your child and say, like, this isn't good for you, and to see your child, like, rebel against that and view you as the enemy when you're trying so hard to be the best thing you can for them.
I think one of the things that comes to mind when we think about the people in our lives where there's a distinction being drawn, where we might be tempted to actually shrink back in shame because of the difference that we see between us and them. The reality is that they need us to be different. Absolutely. Okay? They need us to be different because the people in this world are lost. They are broken. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for satisfaction in so many different places and not finding it. And they need Jesus ultimately. And they need us to be the ones that actually show Jesus to them. So when we live differently from other people, we are actually showing them exactly what they need.
Yeah.
So it's not on us to necessarily like get in their face, like try to convince them that they're wrong.
Yeah.
There is something to that. Like there are times where we actually need to stand up for what's true and right, and we need to say, this is what's true, this is what's right. And in our culture, that's going to lead to persecution. Yeah. And who knows what's around the corner for us right now, but that could happen in our culture. But before all of that, people just need to see us living with Jesus and finding life in him because they need the same thing. So they need us to be different. They need us to be the place where they actually would be able to insult us for our faith, be able to call attention to the differences between us and them. They need that. We need to stand up for him.
It is actually like kind of crazy how the scariest thing for us to do sometimes is often like the best thing we can do for people around us, right? The thing that we live in a culture right now where the idea of love and support for somebody is affirming the things that they're doing, right? And we see in all avenues. I'm sure everybody sitting here is probably thinking of a way that they've experienced that. But oftentimes the best way to love somebody and the best way to support somebody is to speak truth to them, speak wisdom to them, right? Like, and that's coming from Scripture. That truth and wisdom comes from here. And they might tell you things like, oh, well, I want you to love me, or I want you to support me. But if you support somebody, you lift them up. Like you increase for them, right? You don't push them into the fire. You don't push them off the cliff, right? You bring them back from it.
And we do all of this out of love.
Yeah.
And it kind of gets to what Peter says here when he says, if you're going to suffer, don't suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yeah. He's kind of saying, don't try to get back at those who are insulting you. Those who are like making your life difficult, don't try to get back at them. Yeah. If you're going to suffer, don't suffer that way. Instead, suffer as a Christian. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. And it's interesting, he uses the word Christian here. It's only the third time in all of the New Testament that this term is used. Because Christian, it was a derogatory term.
Absolutely.
It literally means little Christ. So people would say, you're a Christian. You're like a little Christ. Like, there you are, little Christ. And eventually Christians are like, no, I'm going to adopt the term. I'm going to adopt it. We're just going to call ourselves Christians. Yeah. He's saying suffer as a Christian, meaning suffer because you're standing up for what's good and you're doing what's right. And you're actually demonstrating Jesus Christ himself to other people. That's why you should suffer.
Wow. So Nate knows this about me, but for the rest of the church that doesn't, I am a fountain of like useless information, like the most random stuff, and not the stuff that's going to win you on like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, but the fun random stuff. And so one of the things I find really fascinating is like the way that we biologically respond to things, chemically respond to things, and one of those is spicy food. Now I am not a big fan of spicy food. Like buffalo chicken with some blue cheese is about like it for me. That's my limit. However, I love the idea of why we like spicy food. The reason we like spicy food is because when we eat it, it creates the same reaction as working out. Your body starts to think you're working out. And your body's designed in a way that when you work out and you're sore, it rewards you for that process.
So you're saying I don't have to work out anymore?
That's
I could just eat spicy food?
That's right. Like just get some Indian cuisine down the street and like you're good to go.
Okay,
like,
good.
No, it doesn't work that way. It does not work that way.
Come on, man.
The spicy diet is not a thing that I know of. I'm not a doctor. However, it rewards you the same way. And so what happens is over time, you're not cognitively thinking about it. Like you're not sitting there going, oh, if I eat this, it'll be painful, but it'll be fine afterwards. You're eating it subconsciously knowing I'm going to enjoy this process because my body's going to reward me for this. And I think there's something in that, Nate, about suffering, that as we suffer, right, as we go through these things, as we get these experiences, we're going to build it up to the point where we're saying, okay, when I'm going through trials, I will recognize God's good. I will instinctually, subconsciously already be attributing goodness to the suffering that I'm going through because I know how God acts. And when that strange surprise comes along that I did not anticipate, I did not expect, that I will be conditioned and ready through the daily suffering that I face.
It reminds me of something Jesus himself said to his followers that's very much aligned with what Peter's saying here about when we're in the middle of suffering, why can we handle it? Okay, Jesus says this. This is in Matthew 5, verse 10. He said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you, falsely, on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And there's a sense, and Peter says basically the same thing. Like, we rejoice in the middle of the suffering now, not because it's pleasant, it's actually quite painful. Yeah. But we rejoice knowing that in the end, we get to be with Jesus. Yeah. I kind of think of it in terms of like being on an athletic team. Okay, I played football in high school, and I hated everything about football leading up to the game, okay? Yeah. The practices, the hitting people, like bear crawling across the field, like all of that is terrible.
Our Philly natives here, right? Reminds me of like Allen Iverson in that classic interview where he's like, practice? Talking about practice?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the game,
That's right?
Yeah.
Because nobody likes practice, because all it is suffering. Mm-hmm. But as you're suffering, and you're suffering with your teammates together, you're all looking forward to that time when you win the game. Yeah. And Jesus himself, and then Peter's kind of repeating the same idea. It's the same idea. We can suffer together now as a part of the team. Yeah. We're on Jesus' team, knowing that the release is coming. Okay, it makes it worth it. It makes it bearable to know that the release is coming for all of the suffering that we deal with now. Not just suffering for Jesus because of his name, but all the suffering that we experience. It's the same issue. Yeah. We trust in him, which kind of leads me to the last verse in our passage here, because I think this really summarizes well, how do we handle suffering? Okay, not just suffering because of Jesus' name, but any suffering that we would experience. In verse 19, Peter says, therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good.
That's so good. That's so good. And Nate, honestly, that's really diving into my last question today. It's one that's been on my mind, my heart, all week, honestly, as I've been praying through what I want to ask you and my opportunity to kind of pick your brain a little bit, which I'm so thankful for. But we're talking about suffering, and this whole passage is ultimately on suffering for the sake of being a Christian, right? And yet, when I talk to my friends outside the church, when they're going through stuff, when they're having struggles, when they're having difficulties, when they are suffering, I propose Jesus as the answer to that suffering. I say, no, like, listen, Jesus alleviates my suffering. Jesus gives me peace that surpasses understanding, right? And I convey Jesus as the answer, as the antidote, as the medicine for their suffering. And yet this passage is saying, actually, no, Jesus is going to put more suffering onto your life. Right. Following Jesus is actually going to add suffering. So my question here that I want to ask, because I need to know when I'm talking to people, what am I conveying about Jesus, is with knowing that there's more suffering to come for following Jesus, is he still worth it?
Yeah. That's kind of the question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because I think our tendency when we run up against suffering is try to get out of it in every way possible. Yeah. So if Jesus is going to bring more suffering, what that could cause us to do is actually to back away from our faith, to be ashamed for our faith, or to compromise our faith. Like when we're faced with somebody who doesn't believe the same things that we do, your tendency is to try to not do anything that would actually cause friction, to not say anything that would cause friction, to not live in any way that would like cause there to be a distinction between you and another person, which means they're not getting from you what they actually need. And when it comes to is it worth it, I think to me it comes down to there's really just two options. I can either suffer with Jesus or I can suffer without him. Because we're all going to suffer regardless. We're all going to suffer in any number of ways. And even if you totally compromise your faith and don't live for Jesus, people will find other things to be mad at for you about, okay? It's not going to take away any sort of division between you and other people. So at the end of the day, I need to decide, am I going to encounter suffering with Jesus? Okay, with his presence, with the Spirit being present inside of me, with him doing everything you talked about. Like, he's going to help you. He's going to strengthen you. Or am I going to suffer apart from him with nobody to have my back? Because ultimately, we can't help each other's sufferings. We can't take it away from each other. Yeah. But Jesus can, and he can strengthen you in ways that no other person can. And so we have to make that decision. Am I going to suffer with him or without him? I'm choosing to suffer with him. Wow. Because I'm going to suffer regardless.
That's such a good, that is like such a good element. Like, because I've had people ask me that, right? When I'm talking about being believing, they're like, it's like, I don't know, man, being a Christian looks like more work, right? It looks more difficult. Nate, thank you so much for letting me come up and interview you today, and just the knowledge you have and the understanding of this passage. It's a tough one, and yet you've just spent so much time in it and understanding it, and I love this discussion time. So again, thank you so much.
So as we finish this time and finish our conversation, I kind of want to bring you back into the conversation. Because again, all of you are dealing with different issues in your life. You're suffering in different ways. And I want you to think about what that is. I want you to think about what that thing is in your life right now that's weighing on you. Because all of you have something that's weighing on you. And the question is, how do you deal with it? How do you handle it? It could be that something's weighing on you. You know that you've done something in your life that has created consequences in your life right now. Consequences that are indeed suffering. Or it could be that you simply have something in your life, some disease, some disability that's been there, and there's very little you can do about it, and it weighs on you. It weighs on you. Or it could be that you are finding yourself in conflict with other people because of your faith in Christ. It could be a family member. It could be a child. It could be a coworker. In some way, there's people out in your life that are drawing a distinction between you and them. They're showing you to be different. And it's causing you to be tempted to be ashamed, causing you to be tempted to compromise your faith. And I would just call all of our attention again to verse 19, because this is the solution to all of our suffering. Let those who suffer, that's all of us, suffer according to God's will. Entrust your soul to a faithful Creator while doing good. And for all of us, that is our cry. That is our prayer. And I think we need to take time today to pray for this very thing. And I actually want us to open up the front here for anybody to come forward that you're saying I am beyond myself. I cannot handle this thing in my life. I cannot handle this suffering I'm going through right now. But you would come forward and you would cry out to God and you would trust yourself to your faithful Creator. And I would actually ask you to come forward to do this if you need that today. Because as you come forward, then it's not just you alone suffering by yourself in your seat. It's you saying before everybody else here, I need help. I need my faithful Creator and I need God's faithful people to come alongside me. So as we sing these last two songs, it's open up here. We have knee pads because the floor is kind of hard. So we have knee pads. You can come up here. You can kneel before it. It's nothing special about this place. There is nothing special about this place right here. But it's you coming before your faithful Creator and with these faithful people, God's people, to say, I need help. God, I need your help. You are my faithful Creator. I entrust myself to you. So let's take time right now, these last two songs. If you need prayer, come up right now. Come before your faithful Creator and let God's people come around you.